talk, and especially to Michelle and Rob for arranging this series. So my name is Jessie, Hendy, and I'm an archaeological scientist based at the University of York. And in this talk, I'm going to give you an overview of what we know about dairying in the distant past, and a tour of the ancient dairying practices around the world, as well as talk about some of the latest findings using archaeological science to discover more about this really important and fascinating food. And just as a disclaimer before I go on, I just want to mention that I have a few images of ancient human remains in the talk. Okay. So milk is a hugely important food and has really an enormous culinary history. And what I find so fascinating about it is that it brings together really multiple domains of life into one food. So of course, the domesticated animal that produced the milk, the bacteria and yeasts used in the creation of specific dairy products, as well as, of course, the human creativity and ingenuity that went into creating a food source with such a vast culinary diversity. So why is this interesting to study from an archaeological perspective? And to answer that question, I'm going to turn a little bit into the present. So the global production of milk is increasing, especially in Asia, and now exceeds 100 million tonnes every year. And this is having consequences not only just for the kinds of foods that people consume, but is also impacting environments and infrastructures. So while overall milk production and consumption is increasing, what's fascinating is that the majority of the world's population are actually lactose intolerant. That means that they don't have a genetic trait that enables the digestion of the milk sugar lactose into adulthood. So I'll just explain a little bit more about this. So milk contains a sugar called lactose, and lactose contains two parts, galactose and glucose. And as an infant, your gut produces an enzyme, this is kind of like a molecular machine, called lactase. And this enzyme acts like a scissor and cuts this sugar in half, then meaning that it can be digested into the body. And for most people, this enzyme stops being produced when you're weaned, when you grow into adulthood. But for some populations around the world, this kind of gene switch stays on, meaning that they keep producing this enzyme and lactose can still be consumed without any negative side effects. So this genetic trait of keeping the switch on has evolved in multiple populations around the world, and it's really fascinating to think about why. How can it be that dairy consumption is somehow so powerful that it can start to shape our own genomes? And how long have humans been experiencing this evolution? How long have humans and animals been in this kind of evolutionary interplay together? So let me give you an overview of what we know about some of the earliest dairying around the world. So cattle, sheep, and goat start to become domesticated around 10,000 years ago. That means that humans start to tame and live together with animals and start to utilize what we call secondary products. So these are things like milk, things like wool, products that don't necessarily result in the slaughtering, the killing of the animal. And this domestication occurred in what is today Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. Around 8,000 years ago, another kind of cattle appeared to be domesticated around the Indus Valley. This is called zebu cattle, although the extent to which people were using the milk of these animals isn't really so well understood. And zebu cattle is still common in the Indian subcontinent and the African continent today. The earliest evidence of horse milk has been reported from 4,500 years ago in Kazakhstan at the site of Botai. And recent genetic evidence, so taking DNA from the bones of those horses that they found at those archaeological sites, shows that these horses actually weren't the species that we see today. They're actually a species that have now gone wild, the Przewalski horse, so that's really fascinating. So then how does the practice of dairying and these domesticated animals then spread to different parts of the world? Around 8,000 years ago, domesticated sheep, goat, and cattle start to appear in North Africa and then move further south. At this time, the Sahara Desert is actually quite green and lush, but as climatic changes occur, these animals move further south. So I'm talking about these animals as if they are moving around on their own accord, but actually they're likely tied to human populations that are moving around, or people are exchanging the animals or that knowledge about how to make those dairy foods. In Europe, these domesticated animals seem to move with Neolithic farmers as they spread across the continent. So these animals and Neolithic communities start appearing in Eastern Europe around 8,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago, and then reach Britain around 6,000 years ago. So what's going on further east? Our picture of this is a little bit less clear. Animal remains crop up at archaeological sites, but it's a bit hard to tell whether they're wild animals or domesticated animals. But recently we have been able to find that around 5,000 years ago, people were eating dairy foods in what is now Mongolia. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about how we actually did that study. But there's lots we still really don't know about ancient dairy foods. So for example, today, reindeer, Bactrian and dromedary camels, also yaks, are used for their milk in various places around the world, but really don't have a sense of when this started. I mean, these are really important species today for many groups around the world. We really just have no idea when those species started to be utilized. So how do we know what we do know about ancient dairying? How do archaeologists go about studying it? First of all, they can examine the animal bones that are found at archaeological sites that might come from animals that were used for dairying. So what they can look for is the proportion of male and female and young and old animals. So if a herd was used for dairying, it would be comprised of proportionally more older females and younger male animals. So if you were to find a lot of younger male cow, for example, skeletons, and a lot of older female skeletons, that would suggest that those young male animals are being killed when they're young, and the older females are being kept, the older females being kept for producing milk for much longer. Another way is to examine the objects that are found on archaeological sites that might be associated with food. And commonly in archaeology, this is in the form of pottery or ceramic vessels, especially before the use of metal for cooking. This involves scraping off some of the inside surface of some of those artifacts, some of those ceramic pots, and extracting out the fats. And then because of a particular kind of chemical signature in those fats, so a chemical signature, isotopic signature, it's then possible to tell whether those fats came from animal meat or animal milk. So you can't necessarily tell what kinds of species are being used, but it can tell you whether dairy products were used in that kind of pottery or cooking vessel. So that can be extremely informative. And this technique has been really revolutionary in understanding our and changing our understanding about especially those really early dairying practices. Sometimes archaeologists find actual whole preserved foodstuffs. I mean, it's kind of like an archaeologist's dream to find something like this. But as you might imagine, it's extremely rare. So some examples of these include bog butters. These are butters or dairy products, sometimes other kinds of animal products that are found preserved in bogs. And this is particularly occurs in Ireland. And what researchers have been able to do, which I think is just super cool, is to radiocarbon date these preserved butters to find out exactly when they were made. And researchers found out that they go back around 3,500 years. And they probably weren't put there by accident, but put there deliberately to preserve them, because a bog is a very oxygen-free environment, meaning that kind of organic remains survive very well. If environmental conditions are also dry, this can also preserve foods in their intact form. So some examples of this are in Xinjiang, China, where these incredible Bronze Age foodstuffs still survive, including these cheese curds that were found together with this mummy. This preserved grass basket, which has a lining of milk residue. And also in Egypt recently, this preserved whole dairy product was excavated. So these are really, really interesting, but very rare findings. And recently, myself and my colleagues, we've been trying to find new ways of finding this evidence of these ancient dairy products. What kinds of species were being used by people in different places and different times? What kinds of products were people making? And it's also likely that these early farmers were lactose intolerant, and that means that they would have had to process their dairy foods in such a way that those sugars were broken down. So can we look at archaeological evidence to try and get at that picture as well? So I'm going to talk for the rest of the talk about two discoveries that we've made. One is that we've been able to find milk proteins from milk surviving in dental tartar, or it's called dental calculus. This is plaque that becomes hard and then sits on your teeth. And the other discovery that we've made is that we've been able to extract food proteins, including milk, from pottery vessels used by some of those early farmers in their food and culinary practices. So I'm going to introduce you now to the site of Cheddar. This is a very famous archaeological site. It's found in south central Turkey and dates to the Neolithic period. So it's a time when people had moved away from hunting and gathering to a more settled community based on foods from domesticated plants and animals. This is what the site looked like when it first started to be excavated, and it became famous for a number of reasons. And one is that the architecture is just incredible. It's formed, it's often called a kind of proto-city, and it's formed, its architecture is formed by these really dense network of houses. And what's kind of cool about it is that people would have maybe walked around on top of the houses and descended into the house from above, which I think is just really neat. Also kind of a fire hazard, but yeah, people much smarter than me have figured that out. What's also interesting is that people seem to have incorporated animal iconography and cattle remains in this picture into the architecture of the houses. So this suggests that animals, so cattle, may have played some kind of important symbolic role in this culture. So especially towards the end of the settlement at Cheddar, at an area of the site called the West Mound, people there started to use pottery for their food preparation and consumption. Here's an example of what that pottery looks like. And during the excavation, researchers noticed a kind of whitish deposit lining the inside of the pottery they were excavating. And we think this is kind of like a lime scale, the kind of mineral buildup that occurs in kettles or pipes over time. So what we did is performed a protein extraction on this lime scale. So this involves a chemical extraction of food proteins that might be trapped inside that substance. And what we found is that these early farmers were processing sheep and goat milk, possibly mixing them together and just occasionally using cow's milk. But we could also see that with their milk, they were also mixing in other food sources. So we also found barley and wheat molecules. We also found proteins from what is likely this plant, bit of each. It's not so well known today, but it's a kind of legume. Peas were used at the site as well, and not necessarily the pods like this, but we can actually find proteins that are specific to the seed of the pea, so we can even see what kinds of parts of the plant were being used. And we also saw evidence of meat from sheep and goat, but also from deer, and sometimes all of these things mixed together in the pottery vessel. So what we're able to do with this molecular information is get a sense of actually what the cuisine is like for these people living 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, which I think is really exciting. We also went a little bit further than this and looked more closely at those milk proteins. And we wanted to see not just whether people were consuming the milk, processing the milk in these pots, but actually what kinds of dairy products they might have been making. So when milk is processed, it typically separates into two parts, the curds and the whey. And the curds are made of clumps of particular proteins called casings, and other proteins go into this whey component. So the whey component is this more yellowy part here, and the casein is the curds here, this white part. And what we found when we looked at the proportion of these casein proteins and whey proteins, so the curds and the whey proteins, is that oftentimes we found them mixed together. So this is probably either some kind of milk or something that didn't involve the separation of these things, more something like a yogurt perhaps. But in one of the pots that we analysed, we found only this whey fraction. So this suggests that people were in fact doing some kind of separation. It's hard to tell what those first cheeses, those first yogurts would have looked like or what they would have tasted like, but by using techniques like this, we can try and kind of get at that question about how people were actually making these foods. So that evidence comes from the pots that people were using for food, but what if we look directly into people's mouths to find out what kind of dairy products they consumed? In 2014, we published a study that discovered that milk proteins preserve in dental tartar, and as plaque in your mouth, which then becomes tartar, forms on your teeth. It's really entrapping a load of stuff, food, bacteria that live normally in your mouth, cells from you, even particles from the environment that are related to pollution. So extracting proteins from dental tartar, we found out that we could tell if people were drinking milk, but also what kinds of species they were consuming. And this is because there are slight differences in the proteins between different animals. So this is helpful because if you're on an archaeological site and you don't find any animal skeletons, you can actually see what animals were around in that environment just by analysing that dental tartar from the human that lived there, which I think is really neat. So we published a study in 2014 and it was quite focused on Europe. So in more recent work, we've been using this technique to find out what kinds of foods, what kinds of dairy products people were eating further east, and especially focusing on Mongolia. Mongolia today has an incredibly rich dairying tradition. Lots of different animals are used for milk, and there are many, many different kinds of dairy products that are made. So sheep and goat are used, often grazed together in a herd that you can see here. Horses are milked, and their milk is often turned into a fermented alcohol called airag. This photo actually shows like a cow-based yogurt being fermented into an alcohol, but this is a still, so you can see kind of how this process works. Camels are milked, especially in the southern, more arid regions, as well as yaks, and then also reindeer in northern areas. So a huge diversity of animals and products that are made by Mongolian people. So by analysing dental calculus from human skeletons across Mongolian's history, we can start to build up a picture of how long and what animals people used. And this, I just want to mention that this work is led by PhD student Shevin Wilkin. So around 5,000 years ago is the earliest evidence so far of people drinking milk in this part of the world. And then several thousand years later, people start to drink the milk of horses. And this seems to occur at the same time that horse skulls have these morphological changes associated with horseback riding. So there's something kind of important going on with horses at that time in Mongolia. Then moving into more recent time periods, we see horse milk being used in a big way. And this really fits with the historical evidence at that time during the Mongol Empire, which mentions the cultural importance of this fermented horse milk product called airag that I've mentioned. And even at Karakorum, the Mongolian capital, there was reportedly a silver fountain made by a Parisian blacksmith that flowed with airag. It's clearly really very important. So in Mongolia and elsewhere in Central and Eastern Asia, this is really interesting because there's such a strong tradition of dairying, but lactase persistence is actually very low. So there's a kind of a contradiction here. How can people be eating so much dairy food, but then not have this particular genetic trait? This is a question that's being addressed in a project called Dairy Cultures, which is led by Christina Warriner. And this project involves looking at whether the bacteria and yeasts inside these dairy products, inside the human gut and inside the home, this is a Mongolian kitchen, whether it's these bacteria that are actually enabling those dairy products not just to be created, but actually be digested in the absence of that human genetic trait of lactose intolerance. And I find this such a fascinating thought that people have been able to consume a particular food for thousands of years, as we've shown through the archaeological evidence, just because of these microbial species. And it also makes you think about what would happen if those microbial systems were disrupted somehow. So for example, if antibiotics and sterilization in this kind of food system became really widespread, as has maybe likely happened elsewhere in the world that we just aren't aware of. So while archaeologists have made lots of new and exciting discoveries about the world's oldest dairy products, there's really still a lot that we don't know. So for example, why did lactase persistence, this genetic trait, evolve in some places in the world, but not others? When did people start using animals like reindeer and camels for milk? We still really don't know that kind of basic question. What were those early products like, and what did they taste like, and what kinds of bacteria and yeast were used to make them? So these are questions that we're all trying to explore in some of our research, and it's really a fascinating field to work in. So I'd just like to thank the people that were involved in some of the studies I mentioned, and thank you again for tuning in, and you're welcome to contact me by email or Twitter if you like.
Yay, thanks so much, Jessica. Brilliant. Right, well, as Jessica's listed her contact information here, if you have any questions, please do reach out to her. As always, I just want to give a quick plug for next week. We do have Eric Palant, who's going to be joining us. I think he's actually on the YouTube chat right now, and he's going to be giving us a lecture on a brief history of sourdough. And you can see from Jessica's talk, there's quite a lot of history to cram into a talk like that in 20 minutes. So please join me in thanking Jessica again for sharing her knowledge today with us. And thanks again, Jessica, for staying up late to be with us tonight.
No problem.
And sharing all of your expertise. So thank you very much.